ready?
I'm ready.
Hello, dear viewers and listeners. Welcome to the latest episode of Extra Extra. It's all about whiskey. I remain Jason, Neil Patrick Harris Johnson Yellen. He remains Joshua Morrissey Hatton. Hello, Joshua.
That's me, baby. I'm in the house and I'm ready to talk about stuff.
Interesting. In Extra Extra, we have a whiskey news story. We bulletize it, we summarize it, and then we riff upon it. And in today's episode, we always get out of here in a tight 35. Can't miss the time and deadline.
Yeah. Got to speak truth.
And so in today's episode, we actually received an email containing this article from Adam Rosenblatt. And Adam writes, J, and J. Thanks again for coming to Seattle and bringing the Padcost and a really super Westland experience double header. We selected a cask of Westland with the assistance of 20 nation members. That was excellent. Jess flew in from Glasgow to Seattle for the selection and for the live Padcost recording that followed. And that episode dropped last Wednesday, which would have been, if memory is correct, November 15. You like that, Joshua?
I'm breaking out the calendar. I want to make sure that you're
3. Yeah, look subtract at that. 12.
November 15th. Yep.
November 15.
There you go. E equals MC whiskey.
There you go. So too many MCs, not enough mics, as the Fugees told us in the late 90s. So Adam's email continues. A Canadian friend sent me this article which features the statement, Rye Whisky in Canada doesn't need to contain any rye at all. Perhaps interesting to the nation, along with some riffing in a tight 35. So there's Adam even helping us get the time limits stated for our listeners and our viewers. And so cheers to Adam for sending that in. This has taken us over to, I don't know, how often do you read The Western Producer, Joshua?
I have read them exactly one time.
I have a feeling I know which article you read. And so we have Ed White authoring the piece, Rye Whisky Not as Clear-Cut as Tipplers May Think. And when I first brought this to your attention from Adam bringing it to our inboxes, you had said, no, not that article. You had just seen mention of this article in the Faceplace.
Yeah, our good friend Robin Robinson had posted in Facebook, if I read another, quote, spirits writer refer to alcohol as a tipple, I'm going to stick a butter knife in my ear. Which I think is what Van Gogh originally was going to do, but he was like, fuck it, I'm just going to cut this thing off. So tipple has been a problem even way back in Van Gogh's
What's problematic for Robin is sticking a butter knife in his ear isn't going to fix the fact that he's reading the word tipple by these spirits writers.
Ow, this hurts. Why am I reading tipple? Yeah, he should have. I mean, I don't want him sticking butter knives anywhere, but I mean, the eyes would have made more sense. But here we are.
So we have this piece by Ed White, clear cut as Tipplers may think, and it kind of kicks off in numerous different ways, but under the photo of a rifle rye, Canadian rye whiskey, bottled at 84 proof. It says the main ingredient in, quote, Canadian whiskey today is corn, although most distillers include a small proportion of rye to add the flavor. So the article really is a series of bullet points. We will leave our listeners, our viewers, to go follow up on all of them for themselves. But there are a few points that we wanted to bring to attention. And actually, it opens up here. Well, let's start at the beginning. Contrary to what its name implies, whiskey labeled as rye in Canada can be made with any cereal grain and not just rye. Here are some rye whiskey realities that might surprise you. I love that use of rye whiskey realities. That's like your dad's going to sit you down now. Like, let me tell you, son, about the world and some rye whiskey realities.
Gather around, children. Gather around.
I love that language. And so this was echoed in Adam's email. Quote, rye whiskey, so quotation marks, rye whiskey, in Canada doesn't need to contain any rye at all. It does in the United States, but in Canada, it's a legal synonym for Canadian whiskey. You want to make a cinnamon joke right now?
No, I'm just going to hang with my cinnamon girl, me and Neil Young.
Just listen to that over the weekend while I was out driving with Zevin. Anyway.
Oh, nice. Oh, there is cinnamon whiskey from Canada called Fireball. Oof. Is that a synonym to cinnamon?
Oh my gosh. I didn't think you were going to bring up Fireball in the first 6 minutes of this recording.
You're the one who said cinnamon.
Regrets.
As a synonym.
I'm overflowing with regrets right now. But just for a very quick pause in time here, I like this use of, in Canada, rye whiskey is a legal synonym for Canadian whiskey. Like that really sets the table here.
It does. I think there are issues with that being a legal phrase, but I want you to.
Are you saying that as an American
continue
because of U.S. standards?
No, maybe. Because I don't know standards from other countries.
Right.
But continue. Right. I'll issue my complaints afterwards.
Okay, so this second rye whiskey reality, scare quotes, Canadian whiskey, can come from any cereal grain combination so long as it is aged for at least 3 years in small wood casks. Small wood casks isn't helping me out here. This is a far looser definition than applied to many types of whiskey. For example, once again, back to my host nation and your home country, Joshua, U.S. bourbon must contain at least 51% corn in the mash and be aged in new charred oak barrels. U.S. rye must contain at least 51% rye grain in the mash. Mm-hmm. So once again, we've got this kind of open-ended term, this Canadian whiskey, rye whiskey in Canada, being synonymous with one another. And then we get into the first of the bullet points in this article that I think is well worth bringing attention to. And it's a little lengthy for a bullet point, but I think well worth stating. The main ingredient in Canadian whiskey today is corn. Once it was wheat, a good use for excess grain grown in Ontario and Quebec. But corn became more plentiful, is cheaper, and has a better distilling profile. Since alcohol from both wheat and corn has little native flavor after going through column distillation, most Canadian whiskey includes a small proportion of rye to add the flavor. And you and I said something to one another when we first read that quote. And what was it, Joshua?
Oh, man, you're making me use my memory. Well, reading that, if you removed the word Canadian and just put grain in front of it, then it simply describes what the Scots have been doing with their grain whiskey, and it was following the commodity grain market. What was more plentiful, what was more affordable, and were there differences in overall flavor profiles? I think we can definitely talk to that and show historical examples of when distilleries switch from one grain to the next, though I do want to bring something up specifically regarding Canadian whiskey on that point. But yeah, it just seemed quite interesting that the way the Canadians describe Canadian whiskey is very similar to what we think of as single grain Scottish whiskey. where the grain can change, depending on what's going on in the commodity market. So with this idea here, where they say, here we go. In this quote where it says, since alcohol from both wheat and corn has little native flavor after going through column distillation, most Canadian whiskey includes a small proportion of rye to add to the flavor. Now, I don't necessarily know the years attached to when Canadian producers switched from grain to grain, but I've got a bottle of Canadian Club up on my shelf that was distilled 1965, and that would have been rye. But when I taste that Canadian Club next to modern Canadian Club, I don't find much difference. It really is this sort of singular flat flavor profile that I think is meant for good mixing and things like that. But you go back to the mid 60s and then compare it to Canadian whiskey of the 2020s, and there really isn't that much difference in the flavor profile. So if they had made changes between the mid 60s to now, they're undetectable, at least to my palate, or those changes happened during a different time frame.
In a different window.
Yeah. I mean, but think of that window, though. I mean, it's a 60-year window.
Just to be clear, when you're talking about flat, are you suggesting just kind of it's a singular hum? It doesn't have the spicy peaks of a rye. Is that what you mean by flat?
Meaning that it's a bit of a one-trick pony. Mm-hmm. It's not, it's not complex. There aren't a ton of things going on. Does it taste great? Yeah, it's a fine little sipping whiskey if you don't want to put your mind to it, or if you just need a good mixer. Mm-hmm. But it's very straightforward spirit.
Gotcha. And that's been consistent across 60 years, you say?
Listen, I haven't tasted decade to decade, but I've tasted my fair share of the standard Canadian Club along the way from various friends' examples, and they all had that very similar, just one note thing going on.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've established that what we're reading as Canadian whiskey and Canadian whiskey production really mirrors what we know about Scottish grain production, column distillation, substituting wheat or corn as necessary. What else do we want to go on to here? Rye grain was used in early Canadian and American whiskies because of customers' preference for a flavorful drink instead of the blander flavor of base alcohols, which is so interesting as you're talking about Canadian Club having this kind of like singular hum to it without many peaks or troughs or spicy spikes. These are hashtag Rye Whisky realities. I know there's another bullet that really got your interest, Joshua. I will hand the floor to you to present it and talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, and then I do want to get back to this idea of rye whiskey nomenclature. But yeah, I appreciate you letting me do that. So it says in the article, some of the chemical compounds in rye grain that provide the wanted flavor are chemically related to those in peat, the biological substance underlying much of the distinctiveness of Scotch whiskey. And, whether it's you, me, or, the countless friends who are Scotch whiskey first and foremost when it comes to what they reach for, when they think of an American spirit or an alternate grain spirit, rye comes to the fore, right? There's, for me, I never made the connection to peat, but there seemed to be a much broader range of flavors, even in something as simple as like a 3-year-old MGP rye. to, you know, some older bottlings as well. It's just incredibly expressive, and it has those peaks and troughs that the article talks about, you know, some of these Canadian whiskeys not having the peaks and troughs.
Had you heard that bit about rye having a connection to peat previously?
No, never. I would not have made that connection simply because the flavors don't align. I mean,
there's an earthiness to rye.
I mean, I guess, yeah, thank you. So I was just going to say that in earthiness, but quite often rye has an herbaceousness that comes to the fore, if not first, more noticeably so than that deeper earthiness that you get from peat.
Yeah, I'm curious myself now in reading these commonalities in chemical compounds to actually find out more about them and see how deep those commonalities run. You know, I also wonder if you might find some of the qualities appearing on a mass spectrometer that aren't necessarily appearing on your palate or in your olfactory system.
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting with some of these chemical compounds, and I'm going to, I'll just get into this quickly, but I'll use a conversation I had with our friend Brian Davis of Lost Spirits. You know, years ago he had this brand called Abomination. It was a single malt that was produced in a very unusual way, and some of the whiskeys I thought were really good, and you know, provided remarkably new and different flavors. And then he released one that he was quite proud of that to me just tasted like straight up bile. You know, it would just, and it seemed too much. You know, you can have a sour beer and it has that kind of subtle note. You're like, okay, but there's enough fruitiness to help get you past the bile note. In this case, it was just, for me, undrinkable. And I know, you know, A, I was not alone, but B, I think I was in the smaller group of people who said something like that, because the larger group of people found this lovely strawberries and cream note.
Oh.
And what Brian had said was, and this may take you to some Kriegelke commentary, but what Brian had said is the chemical compound that delivers the flavor of strawberry, if you're even just a phenol or two off one way or the other, someone's palate can understand that as bile, even though it's the same chemical compound. So I think my particular palate just reacted. You know, it's similar to, you know, some people love cilantro, some people say it tastes soapy. I think we're living in that same area.
Interesting. Here. Yeah. No, it has me. It has me curious what's going on with rye and peat. This is kind of fun. Okay, so then moving on to the part you suggested we were moving on to, which is labeling a truly rye-focused whiskey in Canada can be a problem because the term rye whiskey doesn't necessarily mean much. Rye whiskey, 100% rye, is how Lot 40, a premium Canadian rye whiskey, makes clear its commitment to making a truly rye-containing rye. And there's a hyphen in there that I tried to pronounce, but I don't know if I was successful.
It's rye-containing.
Rye-containing rye.
So what's great for the listeners, you're missing it all. But for the viewers, every time Jason puts up his peace signs to quote, we get balloons just flying.
Has that been happening? I've been on a tab with the article in it. Have I been getting balloons on scare quotes?
Yeah, it's the second time we got some balloons, Jason.
That's awesome. That's worth celebrating.
Yeah, right. So you know, I find it very interesting that in Canada, in Canada, our friends up there use rye whiskey, the term rye whiskey, even if it
Right.
doesn't have any rye, which you would think, okay, if you use the more broader term whiskey, then that makes sense. It could be anything.
Yeah.
But when you throw the specification of rye in front of
Yeah.
whiskey and it can still not contain any rye, that's very confusing.
But do you think that rye whiskey, the rye was doing the work of the word grain? Like you led with that in today's episode. You know, for us in Scotland, we talk grain whiskey. We don't talk corn whiskey. We don't talk wheat whiskey. We talk grain whiskey. Do you think rye was just a shorthand for grain when they were going about, you know, capturing this?
If in Canada the tradition was to create a mixed grain mash bill, and they used the shorthand of rye to apply to that, I can somewhat see that because then you're just taking this larger category and lumping it into something and just say, yeah, I like that rye. However, the tradition in Canada, if you're doing a number of different grains, is to distill those grains individually. You distill the rye, then you distill the wheat, then you distill the corn, and then it's matured separately and then married together at the end. It's a different process over there. So if they were to produce a 100% corn whiskey and call it rye, then that could be it. I argue that it is confusing, at least to those outside of Canada and potentially to those within Canada as well.
I wonder if they got the designation because the corn wasn't doing much heavy lifting and the wheat wasn't doing much heavy lifting in the final product, but the rye was. And I wonder if that's what was drawing attention to using the term rye whiskey for it. You know, it's that one that's got the flavor profile. That's worth your attention.
Yes, but then it makes me wonder what is happening with their corn, with their wheat, with their barley, any other grain they're using, where in other countries, corn is very, flavorful. It expresses a lot of flavor. So does, barley can do. And so, admittedly, and I think you would say the same, I'm really ignorant when it comes to Canadian whiskey and where flavors come from and how they're produced and how their distillation, fermentation, distillation, maturation processes go. So, I think it's something that both of us need to educate ourselves on a bit
Not
more
another thing.
to get a better understanding. Yeah.
Too many things. To add on to what you were saying there about confusion, a bullet within the article says Americans who order rye whiskey in Canadian bars probably think they're ordering a rye grain-based beverage, and a Canadian bartender taking the order probably thinks rye and whiskey are about the same thing, which they are in law. This is just another of the many ways that language, culture, truth, and booze subtly shift at the 49th parallel.
Wow.
But it is that interesting, again, for us saying Canadian whiskey, and we think, well, why aren't they calling it that in Canada? Why didn't they just start out calling it Canadian whiskey? Well, for them, it was just whiskey, right? And specifically for them, it was rye whiskey. It was the rye flavor component. And so it's quite interesting in looking backwards to say, why did this legal language allow for confusion? Well, because it was being produced and consumed in Canada, right? You don't necessarily think about the global markets you'll be occupying when you first start producing your spirit.
There you go. Right. That's a very good point.
To then come down and
we talk about that with US laws,
right,
too.
and then to come down into the US and have some confusion. I will say though, I quite like, and again, Ed had mentioned this in the article previously. I quite like that for US bourbon, there's a minimum of 51% corn. And I quite like that for US rye, there's a minimum of 51% rye. And I like the fact that you can hang your hat on that while still then having your own particular flavor profile, your own way of doing business to create your spirit in the mash specifically. And I like your point from a moment ago about Canadians distilling corn, distilling wheat, distilling rye, and bring them together for a flavor profile. Whereas in the US, we talk much more about mash bills. And what's your percentage of corn and your percentage of rye, your percentage of malted barley. But I do think, and I think the value of this article, and I'm glad Adam sent it in, and I'm glad his Canadian friend sent it along to him. I like this idea that we can start to break down some potential confusion here and get a chance to say, look, and again, we've said this about blenders or producers with non-age statements, right? The Canadian distilling groups are not trying to pull the wool over your eyes by having Canadian whiskey and rye whiskey be synonymous. We're bringing one level of understanding to another country's practices. What we need to do is understand that country's practices to then better understand the nomenclature.
You're not wrong. You're 100% not wrong. And in previous episodes when we talked about laws specific to the U.S. and we say, well, this is a states' right issue, and I like states' rights issues because of X, Y, and Z, or I don't like it because of X, Y, and Z, or this is a federal issue, and therefore, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this and it would override the state issue? Now we're dealing with something that's a global issue, and as whiskey becomes that more global thing, should we have a more global understanding of what is single malt, what is rye, what is insert spirit type here, but back to the thing we've bellyached about ad infinitum. Our laws here in the U.S. date back to post-prohibition, and wouldn't it be nice to update things? Well, wouldn't it be nice if producers all around the world could update things so that there is a more universal understanding of various categories? Then we're all working together to educate, rather than, okay, we'll educate you about this, but this sort of overrides that, and this kind of takes, you know what I mean? Like, it'd be nice to have this unification, a new world order of whiskey, Jason.
The world order has got a certain ring to it. Well, it's funny you say that, because Ed White concludes with a bullet point here that I think echoes some of what you're saying there. Rye whiskey has experienced a renaissance in the US as it is promoted as a premium form of the liquor. The renaissance is only beginning in Canada. At this point, nobody can predict what confusions, arguments, and fisticuffs will erupt as more people begin insisting that rye doesn't mean just any old whiskey, and that Parliament must act. And that's to that very point, right? You use the words, use them, people understand them or don't understand them. You start to move into other markets. You start to see a renaissance. You start to see demand for a product. And I think that's when the consumer has a tendency to turn around and say, oh wait, this rye whiskey that I'm drinking is just Canadian whiskey. Like, how dare you? How dare you masquerade in this way? And it's like, no, it's always been the case. We had an extra not too long ago, or One Nation Under Whiskey, where we were talking about single casks, and re-racking and whether or not casks are discovered because independent bottlers crawl around warehouses over dusty cask popping bungs. Like, single cask means one thing kind of around the industry. It's that one thing you roll into a warehouse, or it's that one thing you roll out of a warehouse. Nobody's trying to be hoodwinked here. And then we turn around, and then when a marketer gets their hand on single cask, and it starts to get out to the consumer, and it starts to unravel a little bit. Consumers think they're being led a merry dance. I could see the potential for that here. Coming into today's episode and into this article, did you know that legally rye whiskey and Canadian whiskey were synonymous in Canada?
I did.
You did know that?
Yeah, I've always had an issue. I did know that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, think back to, Jeepers Creepers, what's his name?
Pete Lynch?
Drinking whiskey and rye, singing, this'll be the day that I die. Right? Don McLean.
Oh my goodness, you got it. I wasn't even close to getting that. My gosh.
Listen, it is something that I have known about and always found it a bit strange to me, but there we are.
And legally,
I found
legally synonymous, not just
legally,
not just colloquially synonymous.
Yeah, maybe I didn't.
Thank you for finally admitting that. Okay, good. Okay. Moving on, okay. We continue with the point you were making.
You caught me. Listen, so the point that I was going to make is this here where it says Rye Whiskey's experienced a renaissance, or as you say, a renaissance in the U.S. is promoted as a premium form of the liquor. The Renaissance is only beginning in Canada. I think one of the interesting things regarding this increasing growth of rye whiskey within the U.S. is that Canadian rye whiskey has actually played a big part in the advancement of the category. Because if you look at brands like Whistle Pig, who launched their 10-year-old with 10-year-old Alberta rye, it had a very specific and expressive flavor profile, and it was a nice counterpoint to MGP, to Indiana rye. It's these two great flavor profiles that I think really sucked people into the category of rye whiskey when rye grain is being specified.
Well, and actually on that very point, I've been sipping on the Uncle Nearest rye that hangs out beside my laptop. And on the front, it calls it straight rye whiskey. And with today's article, it had me turning to the back label. And it does say, this was a lofty experiment that worked. The results of this 100% rye mash bill. There you go. Matured and used Uncle Nearest barrels before being bottled at 100 proof. And then at the bottom, product of Canada, aged in New York and Tennessee, aged and bottled by Nearest Green Distillery, Shelbyville, Tennessee. So a good level of transparency here. Victoria D. Butler, when we interviewed her for One Nation Under Whiskey, was transparent about what was going on into this Uncle Nearest rye. And if memory serves, they are moving towards distilling their own rye on site. But currently they're putting out the 100% rye mash bill Canadian rye.
Yeah. And the one that I'm sipping on is Whistle Pig 15, which is actually, it's a marriage of the Alberta rye plus I think MGP as well. And so you get this nice, broader spectrum of flavors from it. And I love that. Like Canadian rye, Alberta rye is phenomenal liquid. Absolutely phenomenal. When I compare it, I don't mean to sound as if I'm shitting on Canadian Club. I think there are many different expressions of Canadian Club. They used to do a sherry cask one, which I thought was excellent. But it was a very different type of spirit that I think was meant for mixing.
For sure.
Meant to go into some 7-Up or some Coke or something like that. Yeah. But you get this Alberta rye and the flavors are just popping, and you could drink it straight, and it's gorgeous. Well,
and I've got 50% alcohol on this Uncle Nearest. You've probably got 40, 43 on the Canadian 46. On the Canadian Club. On the Canadian Club.
Oh, on the Canadian Club? Yeah, the one that I have
40,
is,
does it not?
Yeah, I think that it's at 40. It's definitely not any higher than 43, but I think it's at 40.
But then 46% in that 15-year-old that you've got there.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah, I think that little extra oomph from the alcohol always helps rye whiskey as well. I think it helps with the texture of it. I think it helps it carry some of those flavors. And even as I'm sitting here in my throat, I've got this lovely kind of brown spice kind of warmth happening from this Canadian rye, courtesy of Uncle Nearest. So, yeah, real tasty one to sit and sip on during today's article. Ed White in, make sure I get the name correct here, as we're regular readers, The Western Producer. Any final words? I feel like we may have just had our final words on Canadian rye, but any final words on Canadian rye, Joshua, before we close out the article?
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I'll say is, it really connected with that last bullet point where it talked about, the arguments and the confusion that this has caused the modern
now that people
drinker.
Are paying attention to the category.
Right, people are paying attention, and let's hope some clarification is put into place. And not just for Canadian drinkers, but I think it's important that Canadian producers have solid export markets and can lift the category of Canadian spirits. And I think clearer definitions of their various spirits will only help the category.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty consistent conclusion that you and I draw. Is clarity aids communication. So. Okay, if you would like to be like Adam Rosenblatt and send in a story, he had sent his email to info@singlecastnation.com. You can use that. You can also use questions at onenationunderwhiskey.com. No E in whiskey. You can comment below. If you're going to take the time to comment below, you should also smash that subscribe button. And TTB. I quite like it. I like the idea of that being a triple TB, right? And then tickle that bell.
And then tickle that bell. So
triple TB,
T, TTB.
See, keep it going.
There you go.
That's us. That's Adam. That's Ed White. That's Joshua. That's Jason. That's the email addresses. That's Uncle Nearest. That's Whistle Pig. This is Extra Extra. And as we always get out of here, peace.
Peace.
The balloons of peace have been released, Joshua.
There they go again.